Good evening and welcome. I'm Natasha Lowell, and I work at the circulation desk and in the children's room, and I'm on the committee that plans programs for the library. Tonight's guests are Cheryl Ziedrich and Emily Bender. Cheryl is on the music faculty at Dominican University in Santa Fe and at College of Marin. She earned degrees from Humboldt State University and Dominican University in piano. Cheryl frequently serves as a church organist and choir director and teaches piano students of all ages. In addition to teaching and performing, Cheryl's creative projects include writing music for young pianists, composing and arranging choral works, and presenting lecture demonstrations like we will hear tonight. Cheryl was one of my music teachers at Dominican University. She always had the most interesting things to say, and I would walk away from my classes knowing much more than just piano repertoire or music theory. Emily Bender has sung and soloed with numerous groups in the Bay Area and across the United States, including the San Francisco Bach Choir, the Tanglewood Festival Chorus, Coro Allegro in Boston, Just Voices, and the Pacific Mozart Ensemble. Emily is the soprano section leader in the St. John's Chancel Choir and teaches voice and musicianship privately and at the St. John's Choir School in Ross. In tonight's program, we travel back to the Regency era and the life and work of Jane Austen. Jane Austen has captivated readers for over 200 years with her characters and her own enigmatic life. Music was once a social activity that everyone participated in, from daily individual practice, family entertainment, to dances and balls. Music was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life. Tonight, we get to learn about how music played a role in Jane Austen's life, the lives of her contemporaries, and in the lives of her characters. I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Mill Valley Library Foundation and the Friends of the Library for making programs like these possible, and also to remind you to silence your cell phones as they are distracting to the performers and those around you. I would also like to ask you to remain seated while the music is in progress. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natasha, and welcome. Jane Austen undoubtedly has more fans at the present than at any time in history. Many Austen enthusiasts can recite the plots of each of her 6 novels. But even casual readers and movie audiences know that Jane Austen wrote about life and love in the idyllic English countryside of the Regency era. Most of the action in the novels takes place in the homes of the characters, in comfortable cottages or impressive mansions. This is where people came together socially for dinner parties or extended visits. Entertainment at home with friends and family often included playing cards, reading poetry aloud, and performing music. The stories often involve dancing at a ball, either in a great house or in a public hall with music provided by a keyboard player or the town band. The novel Persuasion is unique in depicting a professional public concert in the resort city of Bath. Music has a prominent place in the world of these novels, and music was personally important to Jane Austen. Jane was a pianist who enjoyed the habit of practicing daily. Letters written to her beloved sister Cassandra have been preserved that provide us with details about Jane's musical activities. And what is even more remarkable is that the sheet music that Jane and her family collected and played is preserved in Chawton, where she lived the final years of her life. Jane Austen's niece Caroline, in her memoir, published in 1867, wrote, "Aunt Jane began her day with music, for which I conclude she had a natural taste. She chose her practicing time before breakfast, when she could have the room to herself. She practiced regularly every morning. She played very pretty tunes, I thought, and I liked to stand by her and listen to them. But the music, for I knew the books well in after years, would now be thought disgracefully easy. Much that she played from was manuscript, copied out by herself, and so neatly and correctly that it was as easy to read as print." Jane's nephew recalled, "At Chawton, she practiced daily, chiefly before breakfast. I believe she did so partly that she might not disturb the rest of the party, who were less fond of music. In the evening, she would sometimes sing to her own accompaniment, some simple old songs." So in this talk, I'll look at several aspects of music in Jane Austen's England, including women's and men's roles in music making, social dancing, professional concerts, the development of the piano, the Austen family's collection of music, and finally 2 scenes from Pride and Prejudice involving music and taste. And along the way, we'll hear some songs from the Chawton Collection of the Jane Austen Memorial Trust. In the days before sound recording, average folks made music for themselves all the time. In Regency England, women typically provided musical entertainment at home. Since women did not usually participate in either business or government, young girls were not offered much academic education. It was generally considered sufficient that they read books on housekeeping and religion, and that they practice their accomplishments. Accomplishments were skills intended to enrich family and social life, and thereby to attract favorable attention from possible husbands. In Pride and Prejudice, Caroline Bingley gives us her list of accomplishments. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. She echoes the popular conduct books of the day, such as the Reverend Thomas Gisborne's Enquiry in the Duties of the Female Sex, which recommends that a young woman of gentry pursue ornamental acquisitions, such as music, dance, drawing, Italian, and French. As for Jane Austen's personal accomplishments, her nephew says she read French with facility and knew something of Italian. In those days, German was no more thought of than Hindustani as part of a lady's education. These accomplishments had certain practical value. Before the invention of photography, drawing a decent representation of one's surroundings was a valuable ability. Dancing was very important for young people when socializing. And there were often opportunities to practice French and Italian with foreign visitors, especially in the city. Of course, gourmet cooking is not listed among the accomplishments of these young ladies. In Jane Austen's world, cooking was done by servants. But music shares with cooking the fact that it is consumed in the moment. Music is not set on a high pedestal. It is not experienced on a daily basis as great art. As with food, music is offered for the enjoyment of guests, but not to solicit compliments for the hostess. The good hostess wants her friends and relations to appreciate one another, and so she offers her guests the opportunity to share their music-making gifts. In the absence of a government system of universal education, there were some local church-operated schools. More often, children of the gentry were schooled at home by a governess, or sent away to a boarding school, or sent to live with a tutor. Jane's father, a clergyman, accepted a number of young boys as students, while the Austen family lived at the Steventon Rectory. He tutored them in Latin and Greek and ancient history. Parents also engaged specialist teachers to visit their home. Mr. Chard, the assistant organist at Winchester Cathedral, traveled 14 miles from Winchester out to Steventon to teach Jane piano lessons. The education a child received was quite dependent on the kind of instruction the parents offered, as well as what inclination toward learning the child might display. A bright and motivated girl with access to a large home library might enjoy great freedom to pursue her interests in literature, history, or the sciences. In 1783, when Jane was 7 years old, she was sent with her older sister Cassandra and their cousin, Jane Cooper, to be schooled by Mrs. Anne Cooper Colley, whose late husband had been principal of an Oxford college. The cost of living in the college town of Oxford became too much for the widow, so Mrs. Colley moved with her 3 pupils to Southampton. There, the children fell terribly ill with typhus. Their mothers traveled to rescue them and took them home to recuperate. Jane's aunt caught the fever from her child and soon died. Altogether, it was a disastrous experience for the entire family. Jane was 9 years old when her parents sent her with Cassandra to a boarding school. They were at the Abbey School in Reading only briefly, from spring of 1785 to winter 1786. It is believed that it was here Jane first studied piano. At Christmas of 1786, the Austen family did not yet own a piano, but they borrowed one for the use of their visiting relative, Eliza Hancock. Sometime later, they acquired their own instrument, and George William Chard, the assistant organist at Winchester Cathedral, was engaged to teach Jane. Mr. Chard was a very good musician, a fine organist, and a composer. He probably had a number of pupils in the Steventon area whom he visited on the same day of the week. Jane was still studying regularly with Mr. Chard when she was 21 years old. "I practice every day as much as I can," she wrote to Cassandra on September 1st of 1796. Now I'd like to introduce Emily Bender. We have 5 songs from the Chawton Collection of the Jane Austen Memorial Trust. Our first song is called "Begone Dull Care," a traditional song whose composer is unknown. Next will be "How Sweet in the Woodlands" by Henry Harrington, a popular composer who is also a physician, a flute player, and mayor of the city of Bath. The third piece is titled "A New Song from the Chaplet." The Chaplet was a pastoral opera that William Boyce composed for the Drury Lane Playhouse. As a musical entertainment, it is written in a simpler style than Boyce's sacred or instrumental works. "Jockey and Jenny" is a dialogue song by Joseph Baildon from a collection of songs performed at the Marybone Gardens. And the last song will be "Donadella," written by James Hook. Like William Boyce, Hook was a gifted organist, an excellent teacher, and a prolific composer of songs, orchestral, and keyboard music. He was said to be a very good-natured person whose musical style was influenced by Joseph Haydn.
Be able to find like a top hat to take on and put off as I'm doing the dialogue, but I didn't have one. So you'll just have to pretend that sometimes I'm Jockey and sometimes I'm Jenny. Okay. I haven't practiced this, so this is, we'll see how it goes.
When Cupid first his trade began, from fair to fair he blindly ran. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della. No pride could lure him from the rest, no charm his active arm arrest, when once the fatal boasting pressed. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della. But soon the prudent grave is caught, the fair to wanton God they taught. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della. It aimed not blindly as of old, his arrows blunted were with gold, like other traffic bought and sold. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della. And now with laurels hand in hand he holds the world at his command. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della. And sure it is if he the world, his arrows blunted were with gold, that like the I'm gonna go back there. Let's start with, I'm sure. And sure it is if spite of art he chanced to touch an honest heart, that each forgot to take the dart. Donna, 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 della, donna, 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 della.
What's that? We'll need the light back on, yeah, and we'll put the lid back down. Thank you, Glenn. Okay. The trend for music making at home to be the purview of women represents a significant shift from earlier times. In the 1600s, European gentlemen prided themselves on their ability to compose and perform music from written notation. Part singing and instrumental ensembles were regular features at dinner parties. But near the end of that century, John Locke wrote that the study of music simply took too much time and was of no benefit in business. The rising merchant class was becoming very serious about business and increasingly puritanical. It was feared that music was a gateway to hanging out in taverns and drinking, or going to theaters with loose women. Music was viewed as a primitive pleasure. This prudish attitude resulted in the neglect not only of social music, but of complex art music and sacred music. As music became an unworthy pursuit for English men of business, it was considered perfectly suitable for women confined to the home and for foreigners on the public stage. To have the females of the family learn to sing and play a little, or to buy expensive tickets for a concert by a fashionable performer from overseas, these became the musical activities of the English gentry in the 1700s. The life of Musio Clementi illustrates this situation. A wealthy Englishman by the name of Peter Beckford was traveling in Italy when he encountered the amazing musical talents of a teenaged boy named Musio Clementi. Beckford convinced the boy's parents that opportunities for developing his gifts were far greater in affluent England. He paid the family a sizable sum of money and took the boy back with him to his English country estate. There, Musio was provided with pianos and books and teachers and whatever else he needed. In 1773, at age 21, Clementi had a debut performance in London. The sonatas he composed for the occasion were considered to be unprecedented for their exploitation of the piano's unique capabilities. The brilliance and virtuosity of his playing was widely admired. His reputation as a composer, performer, and teacher grew rapidly. For music lessons, he charged twice the fee other teachers asked, and his pupils paid for 20 lessons in advance. Clementi's exalted reputation did not satisfy him. He knew that in English society of that time, playing music in public for money was no more respectable than clowning in a circus. And teachers were considered to be servants. Neither occupation was regarded as genteel. Clementi knew the stories of other famous musicians, that Handel never married because the mother of the girl he loved could not bear to have her marry a musician. Thomas Rosengrave, a gifted organist, lost his mind when a wealthy father refused to allow his sweetheart to marry him. The pianist Johann Samuel Schroeder gave up his career in music in order to save his in-laws from humiliation. Clementi suffered the same kind of disappointment when he fell in love with a French girl whose father sent him packing. Since in England, a profitable business was a pathway toward gentility, and since gentility was desirable in order to marry, Clementi decided to go into business. He began to save his money. He gave as many as 16 lessons a day and lived very cheaply. He invested in his music publisher's business. After a reorganization, the publishing company decided to go into piano manufacturing and sales. And since Clementi's name was associated with pianos and musical excellence, the firm adopted the name Clementi and Company. Musio completely gave up performing and hired his student, John Field, to demonstrate the instruments in the showroom. In 1802, Clementi took Field to Europe and Russia to promote the export of Clementi pianos. Field remained in Russia the rest of his career. By the time Clementi returned to England, his transformation was complete. He was now considered a prosperous English gentleman. At age 59, he married a young English lady and bought an estate in the country. And now, as landed gentry, he was entitled to spend his time on some little eccentricities like composing piano music. James Austen Lee, in his memoir of Jane Austen, relates how music was enjoyed in his aunt's time as an accompaniment to dancing. There must have been more dancing throughout the country in those days than there is now. And it seems to have sprung up more spontaneously, as if it were a natural production, with less fastidiousness as to the quality of music, lights, and floor. Many country towns had a monthly ball throughout the winter. Dinner parties more frequently ended with an extempore dance on the carpet to the music of a harpsichord in the house or a fiddle from the village. This was always supposed to be for the entertainment of the young people, but many who had little pretension to youth were very ready to join in it. Hornpipes, cotillions, and reels were occasionally danced, but the chief occupation of the evening was the interminable country dance in which all could join. In country dances, a set was formed when several couples arranged themselves in lines, gentlemen facing ladies. It was considered an honor to lead the set for the first dance of a ball. Dancers took turns performing elaborate figures in the center lane, working their way from the top to the bottom by dancing the figure with every couple in turn. Jane wrote to Cassandra regarding a ball in December of 1798. "There were 20 dances, and I danced them all, and without any fatigue. I was glad to find myself capable of dancing so much, and with so much satisfaction as I did. From my slender enjoyment of the Ashford balls, I had not thought myself equal to it. But in cold weather, and with few couples, I fancy I could just as well dance for a week as for half an hour." 10 years later, she wrote, "Our ball was rather more amusing than I expected. Martha liked it very much, and I did not yawn till the last quarter of an hour. The room was tolerably full, and there were perhaps 30 couple of dancers. It was the same room in which we danced 15 years ago. I thought it all over, and in spite of the shame of being so much older, felt with thankfulness that I was quite as happy now as then. You will not expect to hear that I was asked to dance, but I was." If dancing was supposed to be for the entertainment of young people, the responsibility for the music was often taken by an older woman. In the novel Emma, Mrs. Weston most willingly undertook to play as long as they could wish to dance. We will see later that Jane also made the transition from young dancer to provider of music for the dancing of her nieces and nephews. When the Austen family moved from Steventon to the resort city of Bath when her father retired, Jane's piano was sold. Torn from her roots in the community, Jane also had to, at least temporarily, give up her habit of daily practicing. While living in Bath, Jane heard at least one professional concert, and that experience served as the model for a scene in her novel Persuasion. The real concert, on February 22nd, 1815, began with an orchestra playing a grand sinfonia, followed by a glee or part song for 4 men's voices. Then there was a vocal duet and a solo song. A Mr. Percival played a cello concerto that he himself composed. Mrs. Ashe sang a solo, as did Mr. Cook. And the first half finished with a trio sung by Mrs. Ashe, Mr. Loder, and Mr. Comer. The Italian words of this song were printed in the program, but no translation was provided. So we see in the novel Persuasion, Anne translates an Italian song for Mr. Elliot during the intermission. An accomplished young lady would, of course, be perfectly comfortable with the Italian language. The second half of the real concert began with another orchestral work, followed by a series of choruses, solo songs, and duets. The highlight of the evening, as listed in the program, was Beethoven's Grand Fantasia for pianoforte with an accompaniment for full band and chorus. This piece is known in our time as Beethoven's Choral Fantasy. It was followed by more glees, solo songs, and an Italian quartet, and the program finally closed with another full piece for orchestra. The length of this program is truly excessive for modern concertgoers, enough music for 3 programs. It's not surprising to read of audience members getting restless and chatting during the performance. Unlike the current norm, concert etiquette did not insist on total silence. Jane was in London fairly often when her brother Henry lived there, and she reported that he entertained her well. They saw Shakespeare plays, comedies, and musical theater, but only once went to the opera. Her letters hint that she simply didn't enjoy listening to singing, but that acting skill was very important to her. She writes, "Fanny and Mr. J.P. are delighted with Miss S., a reference to the opera singer Catherine Stevens. And her merit in singing is, I dare say, very great. That she gave me no pleasure is no reflection upon her, nor, I hope, upon myself, being what nature made me on that article. All I am sensible of in Miss S. is a pleasing person and no skill in acting." I suspect that for Jane Austen, practicing piano was quite distinct from listening to others perform. As she played every morning, I think she experienced the intellectual stimulation of learning something new and the emotional benefit of self-expression. The healthiness of playing music is something musicians sense, but often have difficulty explaining to non-practitioners. Only in recent years have researchers been able to scientifically describe some of the benefits of playing music, such as the integration of the function of the 2 hemispheres of the brain, increased focus and concentration, decreased perception of pain, and calming the pulse rate. Oliver Sacks says the brain of a musician can be identified at sight by a neuroscientist because of increased robustness of the corpus callosum, the structure that connects the 2 hemispheres, and that these changes correlate to the age at which music study begins in childhood. Research indicates these benefits are only a result of regularly practicing music and not just passive listening. After Jane Austen's father died, the women of the family were happy to leave the city of Bath. Jane's brother Edward eventually was able to offer them a home that he owned, a large cottage in Chawton, not many miles from their old home in Steventon. As they prepared to move, Jane wrote to Cassandra, yes, we will have a pianoforte, as good as can be got for 30 guineas, and I will practice country dances that we may have some amusement for our nephews and nieces when we have the pleasure of their company. 30 guineas was a substantial sum. Cheaper pianos were available. But Jane was making an investment in her own happiness. The 1810 Clementi piano currently in the drawing room at Chawton College is not the same instrument Jane purchased, but it is typical of the period. When closed, the so-called square piano looks like a decorative sideboard. It opens to reveal the keyboard, the action, and the strings. The light, delicate sound is perfectly suited for a small parlor. As all wooden musical instruments are known to be vulnerable to changes in temperature and humidity, it was customary for pianos to be shut and locked when not in use, and covered with a heavy cloth. Jane wrote regarding her niece Caroline that she was glad to have her use the piano, but anxious that it not be ill used, and that nothing should be put upon it but what is very light. The technological development of the piano was less dependent on musical genius than on the development of industry and commerce. The very first pianoforte was built in 1700 by Bartolomeo Cristofori, a harpsichord builder in Florence, Italy. He called his invention a gravicembalo col piano e forte, a keyboard with soft and loud. His radical improvement upon the harpsichords of the day created an instrument whose tone could be shaped expressively by the player's touch upon the keys. But when every instrument is hand-built by one craftsman, it takes a very long time for innovations in technology to spread. In 1726, in Germany, Gottfried Silbermann made 2 pianofortes, variations on Cristofori's designs. When he demonstrated them to the great Johann Sebastian Bach, Bach was critical of these early instruments. But by 1747, Herr Bach enjoyed playing the improved designs of Silbermann pianos in the collection owned by Frederick the Great, the employer of Bach's son, Carl Philipp Emanuel. The turmoil of the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, drove many German craftsmen to immigrate to prosperous England. Among them was a student of Silbermann called Johannes Zumpi. Zumpi initially found work in London with a harpsichord maker, but soon managed to open his own shop. He began to make small, compact pianofortes, rectangular in shape. They were the size of a small side table, convenient for small rooms, and reasonably priced. Zumpi's pianos had their debut in a public performance in 1767 when Mr. Dibdin accompanied a singer named Miss Brickler. Johann Christian Bach, youngest son of Johann Sebastian, made his music career in London and served as the English Queen's official music teacher. He gave a historic solo recital in 1768 on a square pianoforte made by Zumpi. He liked the instrument so well that he bought one for himself. As a result of this publicity, Zumpi's pianofortes became so popular that he couldn't keep up with demand. New manufacturers quickly sprang up, including Clementi, Stoddart, Pleyel, and Broadwood. In the early 1780s, John Broadwood designed a square piano with greatly improved tone and volume, and a little later he built his first grand pianoforte, returning to the wing shape of the harpsichord. His technological improvements included heavier strings with greater tension, a scientifically calculated striking place, an expanded treble and bass range. He patented the damper pedal in 1783. Broadwood's grand pianofortes were gorgeously decorated with polished woods and inlay. They were more expensive and more prestigious than the modest little square pianos, and truly unmatched anywhere in the world for their strength and tone. Broadwood understood, as had Zumpi, that his pianos would be known by the company they kept, so he aimed to have every famous musician in London use his instruments. He even sent one of his grand pianos to Beethoven in Vienna. A contemporary letter writer gives a colorful description of a London concert where a Broadwood piano was played by the Bohemian pianist Jan Ladislav Dussek. Dussek apparently suffered from very sweaty hands. A pianoforte of Broadwood's was then brought in with as much ease as a chair, and immediately after, Dussek followed. The applause was loud as a welcome. Dussek, now seated, tried his instrument in prelude, which caused a second burst of applause. This so surprised the stranger that his friends were obliged to desire him to rise and bow, which he did somewhat reluctantly. He then, after reseating himself, spread a silk handkerchief over his knees, rubbed his hands in his coat pockets, which were filled with bran, and then began his concerto. His music was full of melody, was elegantly pathetic, and even sublime. For 100 years, England was the world center of piano manufacturing. In the mid-1700s, a master craftsman with 5 or 6 assistants might build 19 keyboard instruments in a year. Broadwood's advanced factory systems and steam power produced 400 pianos, and eventually 1,600 instruments in a year. Large-scale production reduced the cost and sale price of pianos. The piano as a musical machine was a manifestation of modern technology, industry, and business. Placed in an English home, it represented the family's sharing in the nation's achievements. Musicians of our time refer to the style period from 1750 to 1820 as the classical era. The classical style favors structure, symmetry, and balance, rather than passion. Melody and harmony should be simple, natural, and pleasing, never overwrought. We should keep these characteristics in mind later as we look at the behavior of Jane Austen's characters in regard to music. Classical composers enjoyed by modern piano students include Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Clementi, among others. We also play music written for the harpsichord from the earlier Baroque period, 1600 to 1750, including pieces by Bach, Handel, Scarlatti, and Rameau. All these composers lived and worked in various cities around Europe, and some of them traveled to London on concert tours. Haydn was 60 years old when he traveled from Vienna to London for the first time. Mozart was a child of 8 when his parents brought him and his sister, Maria Anna, from Austria through France, performing everywhere they stopped, finally reaching England for a stay of 15 months. We've already seen that Musio Clementi moved from Italy to England as a teenager. George Friedrich Handel was 25 when he left Germany to give some concerts in London, and 2 years later he made England his permanent home. If these were the great composers of the time, known to be popular in concerts in England, we might expect to find some of their pieces in Jane Austen's music books. There are a total of 17 bound volumes of sheet music compiled by Jane and her female relations that have been preserved. Until the middle of the last century, all of them were held by the Knight family, descendants of Jane's brother Edward Austen Knight. At that time, 8 volumes thought to belong to the famous author were donated to the Jane Austen Memorial Trust in Chawton, where she lived the last several years of her life. This music has been thoroughly cataloged by researchers Ian Gammy and Derek McCulloch in their 1996 book, Jane Austen's Music. Every piece is listed with its composer and publisher if known. The oldest books were compiled by Jane's mother as early as 1760, before her parents' marriage. They include simple keyboard pieces by Handel and songs by the English composer William Boyce. Another volume of music belonged to Jane's sister-in-law, Elizabeth Bridges Austen. Jane likely played from that book when she visited her brother's family. Volumes 2 and 3 are entirely hand-copied in Jane's own neat handwriting. 4 volumes signed by Jane are printed sheets bound together, one with the contents listed in her handwriting. There are songs in French, Italian, and English, the popular songs of the day, as well as music for keyboard with another instrument, usually violin or flute. But in the Chawton Collection, we do not find the music of the great classical composers, Haydn and Beethoven. There is nothing by Clementi. There is one little arrangement of a tune from a Mozart opera, but the composer's name doesn't appear on the page. The 9 volumes that were not bestowed to the Chawton Trust had been divided between Knight family descendants. Known as the Second Collection, that music was described but not cataloged by Patrick Piggott in his 1979 book, The Innocent Diversion. It included some volumes bearing Cassandra's name, But Cassandra was not a pianist. That sheet music was actually all loose at the time of Jane's death, and Cassandra arranged to have it bound in order to preserve it. That was the music most recently played by Jane herself. In the last few years, the owners of the second collection have cooperated to deposit their volumes with the Chawton House Library, another institution located in the village. Scholars at the University of Southampton have made it clear that this music is equal in importance for Austen studies to the Chawton Trust collection. It continues to provide insight into domestic music making in the 18th and early 19th centuries and into the family and social relationships that music fostered. I believe it also demonstrates that Jane's piano skills and musical taste continued to develop to the end of her life. The full catalog is not yet available, but it appears that 2 of these books contain songs that Jane's nephew remembers hearing her play during his visits at Chawton. There are Scots and Irish folk-style songs, but there are also songs by Haydn. All 3 songs that Jane's niece, Caroline, remembers hearing her aunt sing are found here. But there are also some opera arias. The solo piano music is more advanced, more complex than that in the earlier Chawton Trust collection. There are piano sonatas by Clementi and Haydn, 6 sonatas for piano and violin by Johann Christian Bach, a sonata by Kramer, the only composer mentioned by name in the novel Emma, and a challenging set of variations on the tune Robin Adair, also referenced in Emma. In addition is a piece titled Grand Concerto by Mr. Steibelt, a very long and technically demanding piece of the sort, as Jane wrote, that Mary Bennet played with neither genius nor taste. When 18th century musicians wrote about taste, it was usually in regard to ornamentation or how to add trills, turns, and other embellishments to the composer's score. This is one area in which performers exercise choice. Other elements of music in which players make choices include tempo, dynamics, and expressive phrasing. Good choices are made based on extensive music study. But perhaps the most basic choice to make is what to play. The performer wants to please the listeners, wants to perform successfully, and also wants to personally enjoy the music. Overwhelming the audience with virtuosity and complexity may serve the player's ego, but will leave casual listeners impatient. Remember, classical style favors a pleasing simplicity rather than spectacle. All these choices combine to become a reflection of the player's taste. Audience members of the 18th century display their good taste by making suitable expressions of appreciation for the performance, being politely attentive, but never gushing over what is merely passable. The musical scene in Chapter 6 of Pride and Prejudice brings up the matter of taste. Miss Lucas, the hostess, invites her guest, Elizabeth Bennet, to entertain at the pianoforte. Elizabeth modestly attempts to decline, but finally consents. Very well, if it must be so, it must. And so she sings a song or two to her own accompaniment. Her performance is easy and unaffected, not impressive, but pleasing. Elizabeth is quickly succeeded at the instrument by her younger sister, Mary. Mary studies diligently and is eager to display her accomplishments as a substitute for the physical beauty that she lacks. She chooses to perform a long concerto, which she plays with a pedantic air and a conceited manner. Mary's weakness is that she takes herself and her art far too seriously. This self-importance demonstrates bad taste. Both the piece and the performance are unsuitable for this home audience. But Mary redeems herself by following with some popular tunes to which the young people can dance. And so we see a demonstration that music's best purpose is to make connections among people. The other musical scene regarding taste appears in chapter 31. Elizabeth Bennet has been invited for an evening at Lady Catherine's home, Rosings. There, she is happily in conversation with the charming Colonel Fitzwilliam. They talk of many things with such spirit and flow that Lady Catherine's curiosity is aroused. She calls across the room to her nephew, demanding to know what he is saying. When he is no longer able to avoid a reply, Colonel Fitzwilliam answers that they are speaking of music. Then Lady Catherine exclaims, "It is of all subjects my delight. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learnt, I should have been a great proficient." While musical taste is acquired through study, natural taste is used as a synonym for talent or innate aptitude. Lady Catherine is claiming to have enormous talent for a discipline she has never attempted. Her great gifts are hereditary, too. She's confident that her daughter would have been a delightful performer if only her health had allowed her to practice. She turns to her other nephew, Mr. Darcy, and asks about his sister's music studies. And he replies with affectionate praise of her proficiency. Lady Catherine proclaims that all young ladies must practice constantly. Elizabeth Bennet should come to Rosings every day and practice on the piano in the housekeeper's room, where she would be in nobody's way. Mr. Darcy is embarrassed at his aunt's pronouncement made in such a rude manner. After they have had their coffee, at Colonel Fitzwilliam's invitation, Elizabeth sits down at the piano. Lady Catherine, the great appreciator of music, listens to only half a song and then begins talking again to Darcy. But our hero will have none of it. He moves closer to the piano where he can enjoy a full view of Elizabeth. And their conversation, which begins as playful banter, becomes a revealing exchange. He confesses his discomfort at meeting strangers. She suggests he merely needs to practice, as she needs to practice regularly to improve her music making. He smiles and says, "You're perfectly right." And music has again accomplished its purpose of connecting people. Lady Catherine gets the last word, however. She again interrupts, wanting to know what they're talking about. She lectures about practicing and gives instructions on execution and taste until it's time for everybody to go home. Jane Austen reveals the social rituals of dancing and evening entertainment to be celebrations of the values of the community. Culture and good manners contribute to human happiness. A pleasing person exhibits good taste, along with being virtuous and sensible. Music is meant to be shared with other people, like conversation or playing cards. And as such, it is part of a well-balanced life. Those who take their art too seriously and those who claim to be passionately fond of music lack that sensible, tasteful balance. In Jane Austen's world, art is less important than relationships. Nonetheless, Austen demonstrated her personal interest in music by the time she spent playing every day, and by the hours she spent carefully hand-copying music. Her practicing may have served as relaxation or stimulus, as a release for her imagination, or an opportunity for her subconscious mind to organize story material before writing. Her habit of daily practice may have given her increased focus and concentration, and during her final illness, it may have decreased her perception of pain. The question of what she played is perhaps of less significance than the possibility that her playing contributed something to her genius as a writer. Jane was buried in Winchester Cathedral, where her music teacher, Mr. Chard, had served as organist. Many thanks to Natasha Lowell, Kristen Clark, and the Mill Valley Library for inviting us and organizing this, to JB Piano for supplying the instrument for our use, and especially to Emily Bender for presenting these songs so beautifully, and to all of you for being here. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions if anybody has any questions.
I'm going to be using a microphone. I won't be using it. I'll be bringing it to you to use. I would like to ask that you wait till you have the mic to begin your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a two-part question. How was music shared? Like, how would Jane Austen, especially in the countryside, find new music, and where would the music that she copied for those books be from? Like,
I think primarily she would have gotten music from her music teacher initially, and the music that was printed was all published in London, so trips to London would have yielded music. There is some amount of music in the Chawton Collection from Dublin, published in Dublin, and there is speculation that her boyfriend, Thomas Lefroy, would have sent it to her from Dublin.
Hi. What was the relationship of between the classical composers, Haydn and so on, and these other composers whose names, I don't recognize? Was there a distinction between pop and classical?
Not so much. It's really surprising. Somebody like Mr. Hook, the composer of one of the songs that we did this evening, was considered on a level with those other fellows. People like Boyce wrote very serious music, as I say, for orchestra and organ. I play his organ voluntaries, as well as music that was used in the musical theater, entertainment music. So there was a distinction about the venue in which this music would be enjoyed, but the same composers were writing all of it. The issue for most of us is that these names are not so well known to us. So there were a whole lot more people composing than are a part of the current repertoire. But they are there, and we can find their music, and I hope you find it charming, as I do, even if it's not by famous guys.
I seem to recall at the time of the first performance of Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto, the deadline was approaching and the music hadn't been printed yet, and that Beethoven was furiously scribbling away in his apartment trying to get the music ready. A long time ago, as a high school student, I learned to set type by hand for a printing press. How did they do that back then?
Very often, a composer hired copyists. So this would be a person who would hand copy with ink
But the printing?
music. I can't answer for the printing. I just know that most of the composers, when a performance like that was coming up, would hire copyists to copy out the parts.
And he was late.
One more back there.
Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father, writes in a letter to Mozart that he has to be aware of the audience's taste, and he compares the audience to donkeys, the long-haired, long-eared people in your audience, and it has to be popular and easy to grasp. So it sounds like the points that you're making about England were more general in Europe at the time.
Well, and as a Salzburger, Leopold Mozart was particularly frank in his letters, and yes, he did not fill his letters with niceties the way Jane Austen did. His language was often crude, as we know from Mozart's letters as well.
Thank you.
One more over here.
There's a striking difference in the way that music is represented in the different film versions of Pride and Prejudice. The difference between the one with Colin Firth and the later one that you had a picture of. And could you comment on the choice that those filmmakers made in terms of their setting music to the stories as appropriate or inappropriate?
I can't speak to that a great deal, but it seems to me that perhaps those folks are doing more research regarding dance than they are even the music, because it seems like they're making a great attempt to make those ballroom scenes as true to the time period as possible. But I think when it comes to the musical score, they're trying to keep this balance between what's going to be attractive to moviegoers and what seems indicative of the time period. So they're not making documentaries. They don't want to make documentaries. They want the musical score to be attractive to a modern audience. That's my impression. There's another one here.
Well, speaking to that,
Yes?
in that same vein, I think what they're also doing is driving the drama. In the one that you're talking about on Firth, the A&E version of it, that ballroom scene is what I think calls a duel. I mean, there they are, and the music actually sets up a duel between Darcy and Elizabeth. And I think there may be, to your point about music being relationship and conversation, maybe that's part of what they were doing as well.
That's very insightful of you. You want the podium now? Do you want to hand her the mic so she could say that again?
Of course, I won't remember any of it. You understand that now. What I said was that in the same vein as our discussion about music being a matter of conversation and interaction and relationships, I think what the producers and the directors were doing in those movies was using the music to further that relationship. And in the ball scene, and the one that was the A&E with the one with Colin Firth and Jennifer Isle, it is like a duel, as my husband says. It's a duel. And so what's happening is you've got Darcy and Elizabeth dueling back and forth, and the music drives that relationship so clearly. And without that music, I don't think we would have had that same emotionality. Thank you. Sure.
Oh, Jean has a question.
You mentioned a music publisher.
Is it on?
A publisher of the. I just wondered, do you have the name of the publisher? There's that one, that famous Novello.
Novello.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if that was it.
And would you hope that you could then find that same music that way?
No,
Is that
I'm
what
just
you're
curious,
thinking?
Because that's a whole other part of the history than of music publishing. So I'm just curious.
If anybody is interested in a bibliography of the sources that I use, feel free to contact the library and they can forward your email to me and I can give you a bibliography. But basically there's this site called the Lester S. Levy Collection that's connected with Johns Hopkins University. And Mr. Levy collected antique sheet music. And much of it is the same music that was popular in England, even though he was on this continent. That music has all been scanned and is available online. So these little bits that you saw in the slides are shots taken from manuscripts that are held by Lester S. Levy, but are the same pieces that are known to be in the Chawton Collection. So that's what I've used to track down that music. It's the best I can do for you. Anybody else? Okay.
In the novels, they discuss the girls performing concertos at different points.
Yes.
And I know the term is used differently now.
Right.
And so I was just wondering if you could explain what it was meant then.
It seems that when that term is used is that it is a solo piece. It's not a soloist with orchestra. So it might be what we would commonly call a sonata. So a long extended piece, a serious piece, but not a soloist with orchestra the way we would think of it. Quite possibly, certainly for a cadenza. Yeah. Thanks.